Hello, I'm Rob,
And I'm Jane.
and we'll be talking about unnatural narrators and how they relate to the broader subject of unnatural narratives.
We'll start by talking about what an unnatural narrative is and how this concept can be applied to different types of media. What?
I don't know. I was just thinking maybe we could change up our presentation a little. Like, what if we had fictional avatars? Ta-da! Introducing Rob, the sentient water elemental, who's also a pirate.
Oh, that's what we're doing? Okay.
I am Rob's robot companion, JN57.
The bestest robot Wait, hang on. If you're a robot, why are you drinking coffee?
It is not coffee, it is tea.
Oh, nice. Wait, does it help with doing the voice?
Actually, that voice is kind of painful to do. Anyway, on to the presentation. So, our video is titled Unnatural Narrators. Let's start with what the word unnatural actually means in this context. The meaning we'll be using has to do with unnatural narratology. In her book, Towards Unnatural Narratology, scholar Monica Flodernick suggests a definition for natural narratives. According to her, natural narratives happen in spontaneous conversational storytelling, basically when we tell each other stories about what happened to us in real life. Naturally, once we have a definition for natural narratives, it's interesting to think about what an unnatural narrative would be like. One definition is suggested by scholar Jan Alber. An unnatural narrative violates physical laws, logical principles, or standard anthropomorphic limitations of knowledge by representing storytelling scenarios, narrators, characters, temporalities, or spaces that could not exist in the actual world. For example, if we compare Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe and Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, both of them feature the protagonist being stranded on an island. However, Crusoe is realistically surviving somewhere in the Caribbean, which makes it a natural narrative for Alber. Gulliver, on the other hand, is picked up by the flying island of Laputa, which puts him straight into the unnatural territory.
Okay, but what about Jane Austen in Northanger Abbey? Like the part where she goes off on a tangent about novels within novels, and chews out other authors for thinking they're so witty for making fun of novels. I mean, the plot and the world all seem natural, but talking directly to the reader doesn't seem natural at all.
Ah, yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. Indeed, Albert's definition is a little limiting, so I'm going to bring up another one by scholar Brian Richardson. Richardson argued that there are three different types of narratives. First, realistic narratives that tell stories that could happen in the real world. For example, a rider on a horse getting to a neighboring city overnight. Richardson calls these narratives mimetic. Second, fictional narratives that expand the world of possibilities but still follow their own internal logic. For example, a fairy tale where a prince on a flying horse gets to the other side of the planet in a couple of hours. These narratives are called non-mimetic. And third, narratives that purposefully defy our expectations of what is possible in any particular kind of story. For example, a character mounting a dung beetle to travel to the underworld, who asks the audience to not pass gas or their mount will get distracted. Richardson calls these narratives anti-mimetic or unnatural.
That's a pretty good summary, JN57, but it all sounds very literary. What about other media, like say video games? Under all of these definitions, wouldn't coming back to life every time you die be super unnatural? And yet it happens all the time in video games.
I feel like you have something to say about that.
I might. Scholar Astrid Enselin asks this very question in her article, Video Games as Unnatural Narratives. She points out that the narrative, physical, and logical conventions of video games are different from other media, so subverting them also works differently from the likes of literature and film. For example, fast traveling is basically teleporting, but it's completely normal in games and it's never discussed. Or what about multiple endings? Strange for a book, but absolutely normal for a game. Basically, if you're defining what is unnatural and what isn't, you need to first figure out what the conventions are for a particular genre and medium.
Okay, that's all good too, but didn't our title card mention narrators?
Great segue, JN57. Thanks for asking. So, narrators. In the Living Handbook of Narratology, Yuri Margolin defines a narrator as the entity at the highest level speech position within a text. It's from this position that all of the narrative flows. Margolin writes that this definition relies on three basic assumptions. First, if all narrative can be considered a form of communication, then there must be an origin for that communication somewhere within the work. Second, there is some entity or entities that are doing the communicating. And finally, the entity or entities must be fictional in nature, i.e., the author of a text is not the narrator. I would just like to note here that it is a fictionalized version of myself that is speaking right now. This last point has been questioned, however. Some would argue that it's still the real Rob that is speaking. In fact, all 3 points have been critiqued, but we feel that they are a good starting point for a discussion of narrators in digital fiction. It's also important to remember that Margolin is talking about literature, but Jane and I feel that, at the very least, the first assumption can still be applied to digital fiction. In any game you play, your point of view has been constructed for you. For example, the words that describe your surroundings in a text adventure, or the character, or characters, that you play as in a first-person shooter.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. Isn't an actual textual narrator kind of weird in a video game?
Well, I mean, text adventures do it all the time, right? They usually use second-person narration too, with sentences like, you see an apple, or you pick up the apple.
Oh, hey, that's true. But something like that would be very strange in a first-person shooter. It seems that there aren't really any narrators in those at all.
That depends. I mean, the Stanley Parable has a very explicit narrator, and it uses him to great effect. You're right, of course. From a literary perspective, most first-person shooters don't have an obvious narrator. But remember earlier how I said that viewing narratives as a form of communication means that they must have a narrator? I think narrators are still there, they just have to be defined differently. For example, camera work is usually very deliberate during cutscenes. The angles used, the way it moves, what it focuses on, all of these things suggest that there's an intention behind them.
Whoa, I've never thought about that. So, what about levels and environments that are designed so that players go through them in particular ways? Like when the way the space is structured hints at how you are supposed to navigate it?
Sure. Or interface elements, like quest icons hovering above characters in MMOs. You know, the cues that tell the player who they need to be talking to. I should reiterate that these camera angles and interface elements probably aren't narrators in and of themselves, but the deliberate ways in which they are used still hint at the presence of a narrator.
Okay, but then there are also cases when the story incorporates and explains those conventions. For example, in Dragon Age 2, you get to play the tutorial with all of the protagonist's powers already unlocked. But then it turns out you were playing a highly exaggerated story that was told by the main character's friend, and this is why the player was so overpowered?
What's interesting about that example is that it's taking something natural about video games, the tutorial, and making it a natural part of the narrative. In a weird way, that makes it unnatural. So, if you're looking to be unnatural, it's useful to remember what the conventions of your medium and genre are. Can I just squee over the Stanley Parable for a minute?
Well, I did make you talk about Jane Austen, so sure?
Eee! So one of the brilliant things about the Stanley Parable is that it's a narrative about how hard it is to do a narrative in an interactive medium. The narrator has a story to tell, and he follows conventions from literature, but it turns out that dictating to the player exactly what they're going to do doesn't really work when you're also giving them the choice to do other things. It's a form of unnatural narrative that can only work in an interactive medium.
Oh, but we also need to remember that conventions are different not only across different media, but also different genre, modes, and even different points in history. New technologies also require new conventions. For example, what's natural in an online stream would be unnatural in a recorded video, and vice versa. Wait, is that...
Oh crap. Okay, I think I fixed it.
Alright, I'm stopping the music now.
And we're back.
So I guess what I've gathered from our discussion so far is that defining unnaturalness is really hard.
Heck, Margolin points out that the narrator isn't even a real thing, at least from a cognitive science point of view. It's only when someone reads the text and interprets the narratorial cues within that text that a narrator becomes real. I mean, never even mind how subjective genre conventions are.
Right. And different readers also have different backgrounds, so they understand conventions differently.
And some types of narratives that used to be unnatural can become conventional with time. That has already happened with things like multiple endings or inner monologues.
Everything is fluid and nothing exists.
Yes, embrace fluidity, like me.
And also go play the Stanley Parable because it's great.
That wraps up our video on Unnatural Narrators.
We hope that it was helpful.
Thanks for watching.
So, we are on our way to becoming YouTube stars now, right?
I sure hope so.